Hello and welcome back. Today we will be continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series, doing something a little bit different. We're going to be doing a tier list for all the early game production technologies. For this list, I've selected 26 technologies, 3 Tier 1 technologies, all the Tier 2 technologies, and all the Tier 3 technologies that are first available for research after finishing the Tier 2 technologies. Now, I think it's important or worth talking about just the tiers of tech in general, because it does inform your overall strategy for the game. So what you will be doing in general, to just talk about why it's important, is there is a malus, a tech research malus. If whatever research, whatever tier you are currently on, so in this session, we are on tier 4 for our production tech. You see we have all the tier 3 tech. Whatever one you're on, the research speed is going to be kind of pretty quick, but as soon as you research ahead of time, you will suffer a malus for each individual tier 3 tech or previous, or sorry, in this case tier 4 tech, you do not have researched. So the compression condition will take a whopping 8 years to research. And what this means is that, for generally speaking, what you are going to be doing in terms of your strategy is you are going to be going into the research tab, you are going to be researching all the very best techs in the given tier you're on. So at the very start of the game, it's tier 1 and tier 2. And then you are going to be switching to a different tab and researching the best ones in there, and switching to a different tab and researching the best ones in there. This sort of strategy, which means that for evaluating tech in terms of our tier list, kind of the idea that we're thinking in terms of the tiers is going to be, if I can research this tech, how likely am I to research it immediately, and what are the reasons why or why not? This is how we are evaluating technology in terms of strength. So some techs will suffer, not because they're not good or because they don't give good PMs. For example, canneries is a good example. They will suffer just because of how the game unfolds naturally, and not necessarily anything to do with the tech itself. Our primary metric is not like the objective sort of vacuum value of the tech. It is how quickly we are likely to research it, which often very well correlates with the objective value, vacuum value of the tech, but not always. And so this sort of thing. And so let's jump into the tech tier list with the tier 1 techs. Now, first of all, we're going to talk about cotton gin and lathe together. So for the most part, all of the countries that you can play in Victoria 3 will start off with either cotton gin or lathe, or both, one or both, or the ability to research them, and the rest of the tier 1 techs. Most countries will not start off missing tier 1 techs, and so generally speaking, the reason you research cotton gin, for the most part, it just gives 25% cotton plantations throughput, which is not particularly good unless maybe you're playing the USA, which has a ton of cotton. I'm not sure if they start out with the tech, though. Generally speaking, you research cotton just to be able to research lathe faster, and this is why you do it. You also want to research lathe and finish all the tier 1 techs, so you do not suffer malus in the tier 2 techs. This is one reason for researching lathes, but there's another more important one, is that lathe gives you access to 3 different PMs, one for your glassworks, one for your furniture manufacturers, and one for your textile mills. And these PMs are of a special kind in that they change the ownership of the building. Let's take a quick look. So capitalists will contribute 20% of their dividends, so basically how much the building makes. They will contribute 20% to the investment pool. Merchant guilds will only contribute 5%, so that is shopkeepers will only contribute 5%. So for the most part, as far as evaluating PMs go, we really value the ability to switch from shopkeepers to privately owned in all of our manufacturing. And what Lathes does is it gives this in 3 different buildings. Again, the furniture, the tailors, and the glass. And so this is extraordinarily valuable because it'll switch to privately owned. We have more capitalists, we have more investment pool contribution. Also, these will juice up the Industrialists and the Intelligentsia, which in terms of IGs are valuable IGs, but that's a little bit too much to get into. So it will do this all in addition to, producing a bit more clothes. We go from inputting 5 more dyes to getting a third more clothes than we were previously, and this is a pretty nice bump, and the bump is commensurate with the other PMs as well in lathes, which is why lathes is extremely good. And so let's jump in back to our tier list itself and categorize both lathes and the other one. Lathes and cotton plantations. We're going to put lathes in S tier. Almost every time it is available, you want to be researching this first. Generally speaking, you research this ahead of either military tech or society tech, unless you have a specific situation where it's important, and it's very important for industrializing, but it's not the best for industrializing on this list, but it is the one of the better tier 1 techs, and you also need to research through the tier 1 techs to research the tier 2 techs without suffering in malice. For cotton plantations, we're going to give it a C because it's conditionally useful if you somehow have a bunch of cotton, and it will also drive down the price of cotton, which discourages your automated queue from building it. So it has some value, but for the most part, you research it to get to lathes. Now we need to talk about steelworks, and we're just going to briefly cover steelworks because most countries have this at the start of the game, but this is perhaps the most important tech for industrializing early because it gives you access to the PMs that swap you to capitalist, from merchant guilds to capitalist or to privately owned. So that's merchant guild to capitalist, yep. It gives you that for tools and for sawmills. So for the wood and for the tools, if we take a quick look here, we can talk about the PMs. It will give you the access to sawmills very, very early on. What you want to generally be doing is upping construction as quickly as possible. Construction uses a lot of wood, even if you're on iron frame buildings, and so do all of the inputs for the construction, namely tools is an input that is going to use it. And if we switch on to wrought iron tools, we're switching to privately owned. And if we switch on to sawmills, we're switching to privately owned from simple forestry. And so this is going to be important and is one of the most essential techs if you are on a country that doesn't start with this somehow. Yes, this is probably the very, 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 very first tech you want to research, and it is by far and away the most important tech to start going, because what you're going to want to do at the very start of the game, no matter what, is up construction, and this is the best thing for giving you good PMs for upping construction. So pretty much indiscriminate of anything, if you do not have this tech at the start of the game, you're going to want to grab it. So we will put steelwork ahead of lathes. Now, you're going to have steelworks in most countries, but okay. So atmospheric engine, and this is our first tier 2 tech, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, extends here to water tube boiler in terms of just looking at this list. Atmospheric engine is a very, very nice PM. What it does is it doubles the output of all your mines. Let's jump in. It'll double the output of all your mines at the price of some extra coal, so it's not strictly doubling your output for nothing. But if we scroll down here, we see the coal mines, and we're going to swap these all back. 2 bad PMs, and we are going to switch. As you see, it's 5 tools to get 25 coal. Coal's perhaps a bad example because it doesn't require coal. And then it switches to 10 to 40. If we switch to a better example, which is perhaps sulfur, the same idea. Switch back all these PMs. We're going to switch from going 5 tools to 20 sulfur to using 10 tools and 10 coal to 40 sulfur, so that it'll make all of these produce a whole lot more. And it's not you have proportionally a few additional inputs, but overall it is more efficiently. But very, very critically, we are switching on to being privately owned. So this is another part of the feature, especially because what we want to be doing is we want to be building tools, and the tools require iron. And so we want the iron to be on atmospheric engine pumps, yes, so that everything is privately owned, because the merchant guilds contribute 5% of their dividends to the investment pool, whereas the capitalists contribute 20%. And so atmospheric engine pump is extremely strong. It is almost always the first tier 2 tech you ought to be researching in the event of in your production tier. The one notable exception is if you have no iron yourself and you're needing to import iron, suddenly it's not very important, yes? And so this is kind of a good way to look at it. And so we will put it also in S tier. Now, baking powder. Baking powder is a PM that increases the amount of, let's take a look. It increases the amount of grain that you input, and also increases the sugar input in order to put in more groceries. This is a relatively early tier 2 tech, or sorry, it's a relatively late tier 2 tech, and for the most part, never ever research it by hand, and I just let it not spread to me. The reason why is not necessarily because baking powder is a bad PM. It's an okay PM, but early on, as far as consumer goods go, the food industries are not quite as efficient as the clothing industries. pops until they won't be demanding groceries too much until they are above an SOL of 20. And so as a result, but they will be demanding clothes. If you see that we look at our lower strata here, they are demanding some groceries, but they are also doing quite hot. Most lower strata will just be like clothes and grain, and there will be a little bit of groceries like way down here. And so in terms of pulling the SOL up of the pops that matter, because you want to pull up the lower strata pops because they are the ones who drives migration, it's not very good, and it's also not going to be as profitable as clothing in general, and you're going to want to focus on clothes and not the food industries as a result. And so generally speaking, the food industries PMs kind of fall, not necessarily because they aren't particularly efficient, but because going into and specializing in food is not particularly efficient, and you want to specialize early on because you won't be able to get max throughput on all your buildings. And what I mean is, just briefly coming in, you get a throughput bonus from economies of scale based on how tall the building is. And so if you, generally speaking, early on, you want to build tools and clothes. And so because you're not specializing in particular in food industries, you're not putting them in the queue yourself, it's just the auto queue putting it in for you. All of the food industries techs in tier 2 are not particularly good, with a kind of like notable exception. And so let's talk about the notable exception that's kind of okay, and that is, let's find a food industry here. So being able to go up to baking powder, it is going to nearly double the amount of output of groceries. Here we have, we also have patent stills is another tech which uses glass, and it increases the amount of liquor. And so this is another tier 2 tech. And the third tier 2 tech is canneries, and canneries is a little better than the other ones. And so we're going to take a look here. Canneries allows you to use up less grain and instead use fish. And this will be good because fish are easier to get on privately owned. Let's find a grain thing and talk about it briefly. So we talked about how you don't want the merchant guilds owning the building. You want it to be privately owned. However, for the arable pops, they have a different pop to privately own everything. They have aristocrats. Aristocrats contribute 10% of their profits to the investment pool. And so aristocrat buildings are not as good. And notably, they are the guys who produce grain. Fish, you can swap over. As soon as you have fishing trawlers, you can swap over to privately owned, and they will be owned by capitalists. And so what canneries as a technology does is as a PM, what it does is it makes all the grocery places use less grain and use more iron and fish. And what this does critically is it starts to move your industry more in the direction of being industrialized and more capitalist oriented, because it lowers the demand for grain. Grain also becoming cheaper, notably also will affect the standard of living in a positive way. So canneries, of all the techs that are oriented towards the 3 techs that are oriented towards specifically the food industry, fractional distillation, baking powder, and canneries is by far the best. Also, canneries is on the way to researching Mechanized workshop, which we'll talk about later. So going back into our tier list, we will tier all of these we will do them out of order. We're going to put baking powder down here, fractional distillation below baking powder, and canneries we are going to put in C tier, in that it is somewhat useful. There's situations perhaps where you do research canneries relatively early, other than critically the ability to move on to mechanical tools, which is kind of similar to cotton gin, just getting you to lathes. Okay, so Bessemer process. What Bessemer process does is it gives you a PM that's more effective for producing steel in particular. Steel, the problem with steel is you can't build it really, really tall early on as a good. There's not going to be a tremendous amount of demand for it, and so you can't build, this 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 size tooling workshop to really benefit and abuse economies of scale, at least not until you kind of are in the tier 3 tech range anyways. And so while Bessemer process is it's not a terrible technology, often you're just going to want to let that spread to you. The PM's okay, but you'll sometimes research it. It doesn't lead to anything in particular, if I'm not mistaken. Oops, we do want canneries ahead of that. So if I'm not mistaken here, Bessemer process, it doesn't lead to any other tier 2 techs. It just allows you to get into the tier 3 techs faster. For the most part, you're going to want to research all the tier 2 techs before you go tier 3 techs. And so Bessemer process isn't helping you research anything. It's this sort of stuff you're often not going to research it yourself. You're kind of happy when it nat spreads to you. It gives you, it significantly increases the amount of steel you're outputting per thing, but it's not a rush thing, and so we're going to put it in C tier somewhere here. We will probably put it behind canneries, but ahead of cotton plantations, just to try and think. If you could somehow create much more demand for steel, or were to try and export steel to other economies, they're generally not using a ton of steel either, then maybe Bessemer process could get better, but it's not there. Chemical bleach, what it does is it gives you a better PM for both the glassworks in terms of making porcelain, and it also gives you a better one for paper in terms of making paper. Both of these PMs are good, and since it gives you 2 PMs, that's pretty good. What it does, and it uses more dyes. So specifically, if you're on a country that has a lot of dyes, you might want to go chemical bleaching relatively early. And so we'll put chemical bleaching in here below canneries. For the most part, though, you're not going to be building paper super tall, and you're not going to be building glassworks super tall in the early game when you are researching the tier 2 techs. Glassworks will come much more, they will come later when you start getting into the construction PMs that specifically use glass. So if we go into steel frame buildings specifically, but steel frame buildings is a tier 3 tech. Often you get into the tier 3 production tech before the tier 3 society tech, so you're not going to have steel frame buildings early enough to make you want to research like ahead of time to get chemical bleaching, just to try and get more. And this also makes you make less glass, but it does make the glassworks overall much more profitable, so the AutoQ will build more of them and it'll be much more profitable, so you get more investment pool contribution. So it is a good PM even if you're going into steel frame buildings, but it also gives you it for paper bleaching. Again, probably not going to want to research it or push it unless you have access to an enormous amount of dyes in your market for some reason. An example of this is Portugal or Great Britain. You might want to research it a little bit earlier, but for the most part, it's not going to be a priority. Crystal glass is even less of a priority. We'll probably put crystal glass back here because crystal glass doesn't lead to anything. If we take a look here, crystal glass is right here. It leads to chemical bleaching, but that's all it leads to. And so it's even less of a priority. You'll almost never research it yourself. The reason why is glass. We already have a PM before this on glass that gives us access to, and that is lathes, that gives us access to using Capitalist and glassworks, which is kind of the most important thing. If we take a look here, crystal glass is down here. We have leaded glass first, which is unlocked by lathes, which switches you over to being capitalist owned, which is going to be important because they give 4 times as much of their dividends to the investment pool. So crystal glass is also not going to be particularly useful. Next up, we have intensive agriculture, and we kind of want to consider these alongside nitroglycerin, and we'll come back to dynamite later, but intensive agriculture is a bit of an interesting one, and let's take a look at it more in depth in the game. Now, what it is good for is specifically if you're on a type of country that has a lot of agriculture at the start. These two become very, very attractive, and so this is the most conditional one, I would say, out of all of the techs we've looked at so far. What it will do is it gives soil-enriched farming, which nearly, if not doubles, the amount of grain you are outputting at the cost of some chemical plants, and it also gives intensive grazing ranch, which allows your cattle farms, what are they actually called? Livestock ranches, to output fertilizer as well at the cost of some grain, which is a kind of circular thing. They both help support each other. But in particular, the basically doubling of the amount of wheat you have will drive down the price of wheat quite a bit, which will increase SOL. This will have a few nice effects. but you are not looking to build a ton of wheat yourself. In fact, I think the general strategy for most runs is you want to import as much wheat yourself, because the aristocrats, again, only give 10% of their dividends to the investment pool, whereas capitalists give 20%. And so you're not going to want to specifically lean into an agrarian society. Agrarianism kind of just still isn't very good. But if you were already there, intensive agriculture is really good because it doubles it, and it allows you to get chemical plants that are going to be really, really profitable, which leads us into nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin is a PM that allows you to use, let's just talk about the chem plants in general here. I think we have some here. Yes, we do. So chemical plants, what they will output in the base is they will output fertilizer. Let's get off of, what is it? What are we on here that's requiring electricity? The hell? This is bugged. It's not supposed to say electricity, but it will do is it'll produce fertilizer, and then when you add one of these other ones, it will also produce explosives. Now, very often, if you are playing a very industrial type place that doesn't have a lot of agrarian stuff, it will be very hard to get the price of the explosives down because you will have so much fertilizer. And the chemical plants just cannot be profitable because fertilizer is so cheap. And you notice we are experiencing that here in our run, where the fertilizer is so cheap that this building is not profitable. Well, it's not profitable because we swapped the PMs to bad ones, but it's or worse ones than where we're at here. But you will encounter this situation where you have really expensive explosives, really cheap fertilizer, and you just can't get it profitable. This will dramatically increase the amount of mining stuff you can do. And so if you already have a bunch of farms, then it becomes actually quite attractive. Both of these technologies become quite attractive, one into the other. So just taking a quick look back at the technology. Nitroglycerin gives you ammonia soda process, which allows you to build boom booms, and it also gives you nitroglycerin in the coal mines, which will increase the amount of iron at the cost of explosives. That's what they will do on all of these, and it's good for all of these, and it will also give you increased resource discovery chance, which is not that important super early on, but conditionally, these two together are extremely good. And so we'll come back to our tier list here, and we will put them both in reasonable places. So they are not usually good, but they are sometimes quite good. With nitroglycerin, I think being better. Well, actually, I think intensive agriculture is better, but they're better if you're already super agrarian. You do not want to grow agrarian just to facilitate these techs, but if you're already there, they are extremely good. Okay, next up we have mechanical tools, which is a very, very, very strong PM. Let's take a quick look at it here in Victoria 3. So mechanical tools, what it does is it gives you a more efficient PM for tools, which is probably the biggest one. It gives you steel tools, which are going to use steel, so you will need to build steel to do this, and so having to build steel is a slight downside because you will not be able to benefit as much from economies of scale as you would with just upping your iron more, but it is more efficient to the extent that it will be nice. Also to note, a lot of these later PMs will give increased employment, specifically with engineers and machinists, which are more trade unionist oriented, and while in the early game it is hard to empower the trade unionists to be particularly high clout, they are the best interest group, and this is something to also be considering, just kind of in general for all of these, but it's not a super high consideration early on. But it will unlock steel tools, which is this is nice. It also unlocks precision tools for the furniture manufacturers, which will allow you to increase the demand for tools and will also output more furniture. Let's take a look. Where is my furniture mine? There is my furniture mine. We'll swap all these back. Okay, now important lathes gets us to being privately owned, but furniture or mechanized workshops, or that's not what's, yeah, mechanized workshops. Is that the PM that's unlocked? No, precision tools is unlocked. Precision tools will give us luxury furniture. And so this will be, generally speaking, an efficient PM, and it will be nice. It will increase demand for hardwood. Overall, when you are using hardwood in your sawmills, this is nice. And you generally want to switch to it because overall it is a significantly larger output of stuff. And so creating enough demand for hardwood so that all of your logging camps can switch to hardwood is good in terms of the bottom line of profitability, which, if they are privately owned, is going to be essentially important for increasing the investment pool contribution, the investment pool transfer. And so, actually, we don't want to come back here yet. And so this is an extremely important part of it, but it is not the most important, I don't think. You also unlock slaughterhouses for livestock ranches. This produces more meat, and at the cost of tools, which will drive up the demand for tools. Again, you want to focus on tools early on, and this is probably the most important part, but it also unlocks sulfite pulping for paper. That's hard to say quickly. It unlocks sulfite pulping for paper. And what this does is it switches you from being merchant guild owned to capitalist owned. So this is really important. But generally it is important. Mechanical tools is important because of what you were doing in the early game. You were building tools, you were building mines, and you were building wood, right? And since you were building tools high anyways, you want to get all of the techs that affect tools. Remember how we talked about earlier, canneries wasn't that good in the food industries. It's not because canneries is necessarily like it's a bad PM or something. It's because early on you want to focus on tools and you want to be building these tall, and you don't want to be doing it with the food industries. And so the food industries suffer on this behalf, but mechanical tools is extremely good on this behalf. And it leads into a really important tech in railways. And so as a result of all this, we got to put it in the A tier. There's no way about it. Now, it is not always the tech that you research first, and this is the only reason it's not in S tier, because you generally will research atmospheric engine pump first, but this is probably going to be the top of A tier here. Okay, next up we have mechanized workshops. Let's jump into the game and take a closer look. But Mechanized Workshops is one of the best techs. It is probably the best tech in all of Tier 2 as far as production tech goes. And let's jump into why. So first of all, it increases the economies of scale throughput cap. This is extremely important on its own. It is the only one in Tier 2 that bumps up the cap, and it bumps it up from it bumps it up from being 20 to being 30. Herein, we also have those sewing machines, which will produce more clothes. It is an efficient PM, and it demands tools, which helps the two feed off of each other. It will demand more tools from the tooling workshop, allowing you to build the tools higher, and clothes are going to be the most important early on in terms of population demands for the lower rung pops. So if you are building consumer goods, the best one to build is clothes. You want to build singular industries really tall, and so you create this situation where, at least early on, for the most part, you want to get mechanical tools and mechanized workshops, and then build these two industries up as tall as possible, and then let the others not build or whatever, but you're focused in on these, and so getting these techs on these is critical. It will also unlock mechanized looms, which is generally one of the most efficient labor-saving PMs in the game. Even if labor is really, really cheap, generally mechanized looms is good. And just to talk about labor-saving PMs in general, what they do is they will reduce the amount of employees required and do nothing else. So let's switch to sewing machines here. Let's switch to craftsman showing, because we're probably on that. And then let's switch to, let's switch from sewing machine. And then let's talk about automatic or mechanized looms. So notice from here to here, the only difference is we're going to use more tools, again, increasing demand for tools, and this decreases labor by a whole ton. When you decrease labor, this has a couple of effects. One, it generally makes the building itself more profitable, but what it also does is it helps to drive down the price of labor in that state for the rest of all your industries. And so even if it's not necessarily efficient on its own, it can often be something you want to do just so that you can drive down the price of labor and make other industries more efficient, especially if you care about those other industries more, or for example, those industries are capitalist owned instead of agrarian owned. Let's hop back in, and we will just put it in tier S. It also has, and this I didn't talk about, it also has another PM for specifically for producing more furniture, which is also extremely nice, but I think even if it didn't have this, it would be S tier. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put it right behind lathes. Actually, it goes ahead of lathes, I think. I think I would skip lathes more often than I would skip mechanized workshops when mechanized workshops is available. Next, we have railroads, and for railroads, I don't really think we necessarily need to jump into talking about it inside of the game. Victoria 3, railroads give you infrastructure, and railroads are hyper-conditional. So the railroad tech, if you were going to have an infrastructure problem and you know it, clap your hands. I mean, if you're going to have an infrastructure problem and you know it, you almost always rush railroads at the start of the game, ignoring everything else. If you're not going to have an infrastructure problem, you don't really care. And so it's difficult to evaluate because it's just, like, how do you evaluate this thing that you either don't care at all about it or you really, really, really want it? I think you just put it in A tier. I think you put it behind mechanical tools, but it is going to be extremely good sometimes. It's important to note that eventually, even if you don't need the infrastructure, railroads is good because it gives you labor-saving PMs in your agriculture and this sort of stuff. And also there's demand for transportation, like the railroads themselves can be profitable if you like don't build a lot of them. And the very first ones are going to be profitable, and so this sort of thing. But it's mainly about the infrastructure. This is mainly why you go for it. And so, yeah. Another reason why mechanical tools and atmospheric engine pump, are so good is because they also lead into railways in the tech tree. Water tube boiler is very similar to atmospheric engine pump, but let's talk about it more in the game. It's similar in that it gives you a better PM for your industries, for all of your mines. And because, again, I would like to mention, you were building mines early, right? You were building mines, you were building chops, you were building tools, and you were building clothes. Anything that boosts these four is generally going to be quite strong, with the exception of nitroglycerin, because getting to it requires researching two techs, because you have to go intensive agriculture first, I think, or whichever the agriculture one is. But this will give you access to condensing pump engine, which is just further more efficient. It will require more coal, except for the one that produces coal, and it will produce more output of whatever that thing is. And also condensing pump engine will also give you, let's go look at the tech. It also gives you a PM condensing water tube boiler, the tech is water tube boiler, will give you a labor-saving PM on your furniture manufacturers, your tooling workshops, your paper mills, your steel mills, and your motor industries. Now, if your SOL is really high and wages are extremely high, this will actually be really good, and if it's not so good. And so what we will do is we will put this in A tier. Very strong tech because it is giving you what you are wanting kind of early on in the game, and it is extremely strong in situations where you are... when the labor-saving PM is useful, but it's not as strong as railways or mechanical tools. Mechanical tools is allowing you to get off of a merchant guild-owned thing, and it's also tools are what you want kind of like more than anything in terms of the industrialization. And so water tube boiler, while it is often an extremely early one, it is not the best. And this is all of the tier 2 techs. You could maybe shift canneries to C tier, I think, because I think it is a step above these other ones. And you notice a lot of these are suffering at the hands of you not really wanting to build these industries early on. This is the food industries here, the glass industries to a lesser extent. You also have the cotton gin, which is just instrumentally useful to being able to research lathes. And you have Bessemer process, which... you just don't have enough steel for it really to feel super fantastic, although you do have mechanical tools, so it's not terrible. You have the very conditional intensive agriculture and nitroglycerin, and so this is just an extension of that. The same idea holds for improved fertilizers and dynamite. So let's jump in and talk about those real quick. And this is now we're into the tier 3 tech here. So the first up, we're going to talk about dynamite and improved fertilizer. So notably, dynamite does lead into pump jacks. And while we're not going to rate pump jacks today, pump jacks is quite strong. And so dynamite is often influenced by, if you are already really agrarian, dynamite is going to be extremely strong. Improved fertilizer, same thing. What it will do is it will give you it'll give you a better PM for your fertilizer in your chem plants, and it will also give you a better PM fertilizers in your grain stuff to make more grain. So make a lot more grain. So if you already have a whole bunch of grain producing places, improved fertilizer can be something you want to research. Dynamite is often a bit better because For this last one, you had to research intensive to get into nitroglycerin. It's kind of the similar pairing, but now you don't need to research to get into it. It will unlock vacuum evaporation, which will give you more explosives than your chem plants. Often when you're not going agricultural, you have this problem of overproducing fertilizer, underproducing explosives, so this will be particularly good. It leads into pump jacks. It gives you explosive shells, which is, it's okay. Generally, ammunition plants are not built tall. You don't build a lot of them. They're not super profitable, so this is kind of whatever. And it unlocks dynamite, which again is going to give you more of these resources at the expense of explosives, and you get improved resource discovery chance. So let's put these in to our tier list. These two. So for improved fertilizers, we're going to put it probably at the back of this, at the very back of B tier, where it's situationally useful if you already have a ton of grain producing stuff. And then we're going to put dynamite at the front here. Dynamite in particular, you don't need to research another one to get into it. So for example, intensive agriculture, you have to research to get into nitroglycerin. It will unlock stuff for your mines in particular. It gives you more resource discovery chance, and it is important for being able to research pump jacks if you have a ton of plantations, and so this is going to be good. Next up, we have open hearth process, which is extraordinarily similar to Bessemer process, but it is later on in the game when you start to be building more steel. And in particular, if we take a look in the tier 3 techs, if we look at society tech and we see steel frame buildings, once you swap to steel frame buildings, you will have an enormous demand for steel. And so very often you want to research steel frame buildings before or kind of near when you have open hearth process, or if one gnat spreads to you, you get the other, in order to facilitate building a whole lot, ramping up your construction in a way that is not extraordinarily painful by the increased steel, because this will output a lot more steel. It's a fairly efficient PM, right? It's more efficient than the last one, but it is really kind of in conjunction with steel frame buildings is going to be the strategy. But that is a reasonable condition for wanting to go this relatively early. And so we will put this in B tier, kind of a low B tier, because these agrarian ones, these ones when you have a pretty big agricultural base, are going to be extraordinarily good. And this is situationally good if you're getting steel frame buildings already. Next up, we have reinforced concrete. This just gives 15% throughput bonus on construction, which is a bit difficult to evaluate. What it is going to do is it's going to be extremely good. So the more expensive your labor is, the better throughput bonuses are. The cheaper your labor is, the worse it is, because what throughput does is it increases all of the input goods, yes, and it increases all of the output. And so it's going to increase all of the goods required for the construction, and it's going to increase the output. And so what the difference is between this is, since construction centers don't really take a long time to build, the amount of time it takes to build the construction centers is not really the concern here. What's the concern is the price of the labor. And so reinforced concrete is going to be particularly good if you have really expensive labor in your market and the normal wage is really high. Now, the normal wage is the average wage of all the people in your incorporated territory, and this is what gets paid to the people in the construction centers. And so situationally, reinforced concrete is quite good, and I think it is good more often than dynamite is good, or is going to be useful in more contexts. So we're going to actually put it ahead of dynamite here. Next up, we have rotary valve engine. Now, rotary valve engine is a labor-saving PM, and it leads into, it uses up coal, and it leads into, and I think the lead-in is probably the most important thing, it leads into electricity in some of the better tier 3 and tier 4 techs. And so often you get rotary valve engine just to kind of go into electrical generation, which is going to give you some other stuff. We're not going to talk too much about electrical generation now, but it unlocks this PM, which increases tools and coal, and will decrease the amount of labor, and it unlocks it in several places. Rotary valve engine is going to be good, conditionally, in the event that you, again, have really expensive labor. And so we are going to put it in the C tier, though, with the understanding that often you will research it just to be able to research electricity, if you are trying to get electricity quickly, but often you will also just kind of like leave it alone, not really go for it. Gonna put it below canneries here. Next up, we have rubber mastication. On its own, I'm not sure that anything, there's a way to have any demand for rubber until you research the stuff after it. You might research this in the event that you are playing a country that somehow has access to an enormous amount of rubber. But for the most part, you're almost never going to research this yourself, or I think you should almost never research it yourself. There's no demand for rubber when you build it, and then you have to create the demand by researching vulcanization next, which unlocks elastics for textile mills, and it also unlocks bike messengers. I don't think bike messengers is all that good anyways, but I perhaps haven't given it enough consideration. And so overall, you just kind of let this spread to you. Eventually rubber is important, but this is probably the worst tech in this tier list. So we're going to put it at F tier. Situationally, if you somehow have an enormous amount of rubber, you might want to research it. I don't know, but no, we're going to put it at an F tier. Next, we have shift work. Shift work gives plus 20 to economies of scale. It's very, very, very simple, and it's also very, very, very strong. And shift work is going to be conditionally extremely useful if you are going to, at the time. So you have to research mechanized workshops before shift work. This will bring your throughput cap from 20 to 30, and shift work will bring it from 30 to 50. If you have buildings over level 51, or you're approaching buildings over level 51, and in the early game, we're talking about building tools and clothing, shift work is going to be one of the best techs, and if your economy is not big enough to have gotten that far to when the point you research shift work, it's going to do literally nothing. And so what we are going to do is we are going to put it at the bottom of at the bottom of A tier, with the idea that sometimes it is one of the very best techs to research, and sometimes it does literally nothing. And so, as a general strategy, though, as you're transitioning in the mid-game, you do want to build buildings up to 51, you want to research shift work, and you want to get max throughput bonus. Okay, next we have Steam Donkey. Now, what Steam Donkey does, let's jump in, is it gives you the PM Steam Donkey in several different places, which is a labor-saving PM, which will bring down the price of labor. And I actually think Steam Donkeys is one of the better ones, and Steam Donkeys, again, will lead into pump checks, and so it has a little bit more value on this regard. But the Steam Donkey PM, it uses coal, it uses engines, and it decreases labor. You can use it on the mines and the logging camps. I really like that it's on the logging camps, because you can use this to decrease the price of labor in just about any province. And so, coming back to it, it is going to be the better of the labor-saving PM techs. As far as I'm concerned, it's better than rotary valve engine, and it is sometimes pretty useful, and sometimes you want to be going into pump checks, which is another kind of one of the usefulness of rotary valve engine. Rotary valve engine, in particular, though, is generally not as efficient, but it affects your manufacturing good. This affects your rural goods. Often you will have places that don't have a lot of population as well, that will benefit a lot from the labor-saving PM, even though they have a lot of resources. And so we're going to put this at the very back of B tier. As a result, we're running out of space here. Steel railways is an interesting one. Let's take a look at steel railways, and we're going to take a look at vacuum canning at the same time here, because we don't want to cross over too much. But steel railways, so first off, it gives you iron tankers. You're, never going to use this. Or, you get steel rail cars way before you get the access to oil, which you get with pump jacks, generally speaking. And so you're more here about the steel passenger carriages. And I think in order to kind of appreciate what this is doing is we have to come into here. And so this is a bit of a more complex one with the railroads, and we won't get into the full details of it, but let's switch back to steam trains and cargo prioritization. Now, we're going to just take a look at cargo prioritization. When we have cargo prioritization, we will just be outputting, per level, 50 transportation. Transportation is one of the side effects of also increasing the infrastructure. You see that this building has a really big negative balance. The way we make the building profitable is we increase the transportation output because they don't get paid based on infrastructure. Generally speaking, you will be paying a subsidy, and the subsidy you'll be paying on the railway in order to maintain the employment so you get the infrastructure. The lower you can decrease the subsidy, the better. One way to decrease the subsidy is to make the building more profitable, and you can do that by switching on to something else that causes them to produce more transportation. Notably, wooden passenger carriages and steel passenger carriages will produce less infrastructure. If we swap onto them, they will produce less infrastructure. Notably, they produce the... Well, I thought they produced the same amount less. Oh, they do produce the same amount less, but they require different levels of employment. Okay. So this will have some unemployment and this one won't. And so what this does is it produces more transportation, and the transportation increases the profitability of the building. And when the building's profitability increases, we just have minus 20k to plus 50k here, or plus 31k, and here we should have like something in between. When the profitability increases, that means you have to pay less in subsidies. So this is really, really good. Also, so this is thing one of steel passenger carriages being good. But wait, there's more. What it will also do is for all of your arable land stuff that is plantation-based, you will have the road carts to rail transportation, which uses transportation. So this will further increase the price of transportation. It'll make transportation more expensive, which makes the buildings more profitable. This is one way of reducing the subsidies as well. But what this will also do is that it will decrease, it is a labor-saving PM here. You notice the labor is going to go down by 236k for 234 buildings, so 1k per building. And so this will overall decrease the price of labor in all your places, because when you make labor cheaper for the cotton plantation, that means whoever's competing with the cotton plantation for the labor has to pay even less for the labor. So if I have a level 50 textile mill in a place where I have cotton plantations as well, and they're both competing for labor, when I lower the price of labor in the cotton plantation, I lower the price of labor in the textile mill as well, and I make that more profitable. And so the labor saving effect of increasing transportation and making it more available and being able to turn on more of these also has to be considered in conjunction when evaluating steel passenger trains, which makes steel passenger trains really good. Vacuum canning is basically the same idea as the fish, except it will consume less grain, so it's a similar idea in terms of the canning. In terms of canneries, it's very, very similar to canneries, but what it will do is the decreasing the grain is something you value. It will also consume oil. And so this PM is often quite good if you just happen to have oil, and it's not good at all if you don't have oil, and this is kind of a good way to think about it. So let's jump back to our tier list and kind of assign them. And then we will quickly review our tier list. So steel railway cars, I think, is maybe A tier and maybe high B, something like this. It is often going to be really good. It is going to be good depending on how many railroads you have. Shocker. And it will also increase the price of steel, which can make stuff like open hearth process better or the other steel PM better. For vacuum canning, we're going to put it at the end of B tier here, behind steam donkeys. Okay, the reason why is I think it's better than canneries. It's an especially efficient PM if you have oil, and the oil's really cheap. And it's also really nice to kind of start oil production off the back of something. And also later on, canneries is not as good early on, right? Because you're not building as many food industries. By the time you get to vacuum canning, you will be building more food industries. And so it's a little bit better, but it's also a dead-end tech. It doesn't lead to anything. You don't need to research it. You can often let it nat spread to you, this sort of thing. Very often the time you will be researching it is just to finish out the tier 3 techs, to finish out the tier 3 techs or something. So maybe it actually deserves to score a lot lower, because canneries will get you to Mechanized workshop. Vacuum canning doesn't get you nowhere, really. Well, it doesn't get you anywhere. And so let's actually jump back in. I've changed my mind here. I think it's actually D tier. And I think it's the best one in D tier, and it's conditionally good, or maybe it's the back of C tier. It's conditionally good, but I still think you're not at a phase of the game where you're actually going to be building a ton of food industries, and it doesn't lead to any other techs, and it is sometimes good if you already have oil. So let's quickly run through the tiered list. Steelworks is the best tech, but almost everyone's going to start with it. It does give access to capitalist-owned for both the sawmills and also for the tooling workshops. Mechanized workshop we have next. It gives plus 10 to economies of scale. It gives you a whole bunch of PMs that increase demand for tools, which you're already wanting to focus on anyways. And so you're going to be building economies of scale, and then you're going to be facilitating the economies of scale. One of the problems with building like a tooling workshop up to, let's say, 30 in the early game is that you can't create enough demand for all the tools, and so they can't be super profitable. So often what you do is you export to facilitate building tall to abuse the economies of scale throughput, which effectively gives you more buildings per building. What this does is it gives you plus 10 to that. It gives you demand for it, and it is also a really strong PM for clothing, which is the best consumer good in terms of pops demanding it and increasing quality of life for the pops. It also gives you one for the furniture manufacturers as well. Next we have Laissez, which is a tier 1 tech. It's generally speaking the best tech it's the one tech you really want to research because it unlocks all the capitalist PMs. Atmospheric engine pump, it unlocks the capitalist PM for the mines specifically, and also increases their output. And early game, you are going to be wanting to build mines, chop chops, and mechanized workshops, or sorry, not mechanized work. Well, eventually you do, and tools. So this is why atmospheric engine pump is almost always going to be the first tier 2 tech you research. And mechanized workshops is going to be one that you research almost as soon as it is available. It's not available at the first on tier 2. Mechanical tools is also extremely strong since you're going tools mainly, but it does give you the capitalist PM for paper. Railways is going to be conditionally extraordinarily important depending on what your infrastructure situation is, but it also is going to be, there's other effects as well, like giving you the labor-saving PMs in the agricultural areas, which can drive down the price of labor. Water tube boiler is efficient for the mining, which is going to be important early on, and also has a labor-saving PM. Shift work gives you increased economies of scale cap. It's either going to do literally nothing for your economy, or it's going to be extremely important. Steel railway cars is going to make the railroads more efficient, and so for reasons we just discussed. Reinforced concrete is particularly useful. It increases throughput on construction. It's particularly useful if you have a really, really high normal wage or standard of living, as it's going to allow you to up construction by quite a bit. Also, if you just, so it's the higher proportion of your construction cost is in labor, the better reinforced concrete is. Next, we have dynamite, intensive agriculture, nitroglycerin, and improved fertilizer, all of which are just kind of in the block of, these are really good if you just happen to have a huge agrarian base, but dynamite in particular leads into pump jacks, and you don't need to research an intensive agriculture in order to lead into it. So sometimes you research dynamite even if you don't have a lot of agrarian stuff going on, which is kind of less so with nitroglycerin, because you have to research improved farm, or you have to research intensive agriculture before you can go nitroglycerin. Intensive agriculture also unlocks the fertilizer things. Open hearth process is going to greatly increase steel, and you sometimes want to actively go for it when you unlock steel frame building, which is why open hearth process is up here, and why Bessemer process is down here, even though they functionally are very, very similar. Steam donkeys is a labor-saving PM. It gives labor saving for rural areas, which I think are generally better than labor saving for manufacturing stuff, so it gives it for the mines and the wood and chops, and it also leads into pump jacks, which can be quite good. Canneries, we discussed, it decreases the amount of grain consumed and increases fish consumption, and this is actually an interesting little bit of thing, but overall it's on the food industries, which you do not want to be building early when canneries is available, and because of this canneries suffers. But it is interesting, the dynamic for like trying to make your upper rung pops eat food industry stuff. It also decreases the demand for meat, because that's a substitute good, which helps encourage your economy to build even less agrarian stuff. And so like it's an interesting one. If the game balance changes, this might be an interesting one. Rotary valve engine gives you labor saving PMs for your manufacturing industries. Generally, you don't want to research it very early, except it leads into electricity, which makes it good. Chemical bleaching, we already talked about Bessemer process. Chemical bleaching and crystal glass are both giving PMs for stuff you're not expanding super, super tall early on in the glass, and so and also the paper for chem bleaching, and so that's not very important, although chemical bleaching is specifically very good if you happen to have an enormous amount of dyes in your market, just way too much, and the dye price is very low. This will make buildings very profitable. Bessemer process we talked about. Cotton gin, you mainly just research to lead in the lathes, but often a lot of game starts open up with researching cotton plantations, so maybe cotton plantations you could move to a B on this consideration, but it's only extremely good if you also have a lot of cotton, so like maybe the USA, this type of stuff. Crystal glass we talked about. Vacuum canning, meh. It's sometimes good if you have oil, and this is kind of the shtick. It doesn't lead into any other text. You can let it nat spread to you. And then we have baking powder and fractional distillation, which suffer the same reason the canneries do, but they're worse because they don't affect your autocue in a as robust way. And rubber mastication is worst, the worstest, because in general, you need to research another tech after it. It's okay-ish if you, I just know you have a bunch of rubber, so I guess if you were playing a South American or like a Congo type country, it would be okay. But overall, I think this is a fairly nice tier list for the early game techs, as well as kind of why you're going to want to research these, the situations in which it's important. I think if you feel that I didn't cover the technologies enough, feel free to let me know. If you feel that I spent too long talking about the tech and should have just rated stuff out quicker, also let me know. I will either be doing, next up I think I will be doing either the late game production text or the early game text for the other two trees, something like this. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. You know, do the YouTube algorithm stuff. It does help out. We're really close to 1,000 subs, which is cool. And have a good day.